Welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Derek and I thought it was about time that we revisited the subject that we haven't actually covered since our first episode, I don't think, have we?
No.
Our first episode, we looked at the Anarchy because it was a subject that was close to both mine and Derek's hearts at the time. And I think we've tended to be away from it since
We've
then.
done Henry II and Eleanor, we've done Richard, we've done John.
Yeah, we just haven't done much about the Anarchy. So we thought we'd better put that right and look today at two of the leading protagonists and ignore King Stephen, which is always my favourite part. Apologies to King Stephen. But the two women who were the leading protagonists in the Anarchy are so much more interesting. So today, Derek and I are going to look at the two Matildas.
And I suppose where we should start is to explain, if in case somebody doesn't know, and it's quite possible a lot of people don't know, who were the two Matildas that we're referring to and how were they related?
Most people know about Empress Matilda and the fact that she was the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I and the heir to the throne, and that nasty, horrible King Stephen usurped her throne because he was a man. So that's Empress Matilda. She was the daughter of King Henry I and Matilda of Scotland. So her grandmother was Margaret of Wessex, who was known to history as Saint Margaret and was a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. Now, King Stephen's wife, confusingly and annoyingly when you're writing about all these women, was also called Matilda, Matilda of Boulogne. And she was the daughter of Mary of Scotland, the sister to Empress Matilda's mother. So Empress Matilda and Matilda of Boulogne were first cousins. They were both granddaughters of St. Margaret of Scotland, both direct descendants of Alfred the Great through their grandmother. Matilda of Boulogne was married to King Stephen. She was the daughter of Eustace of Boulogne and his only child. So she was the sole heiress of the very rich and powerful county of Boulogne. And I think she was actually the power behind Stephen's claim to the throne. He had the claim. She had the resources to get him on the throne.
If anybody's confused about the number of Matildas, we all are. There is a surfeit of Matildas in this topic, and indeed in the early Middle Ages anyway. But that's where they come from then. It all starts with Alfred the Great. It's his fault.
Yeah, but the Matildas don't. The Matildas start with Matilda of Flanders, who was the grandmother of King Stephen and
You
Empress
just
Matilda.
had to introduce another Matilda, didn't you? Do they not have any other names?
I think when I wrote Women of the Anarchy, when I did the index, there are 12 Matildas in
And the good
index.
news, folks, is we're only talking about two of them.
But if you ever get a question on the Anarchy, about a woman in the Anarchy, and you don't know the answer, guess Matilda.
Okay, so we have these two Matildas, and they basically end up on opposite sides. So that's handy because we're always talking about a Matilda on one side or the other. Do we need to say why she's called Empress Matilda? Because she was married to Henry, was it, the Holy Roman Emperor?
Yep, she was married when she was 11 years and 11 months old, just before her 12th birthday. So she spent most of her childhood in Germany.
Yeah.
But we had the disaster of the White Ship in England in 1120, where William the Atheling, the only male legitimate heir of Henry I, died. Stephen apparently disembarked just in time and avoided a watery grave. Yeah, that would have solved everything.
Well, yeah, it might have caused more problems. Okay, so the Empress Matilda, in her early in her teens and early 20s, was married to Henry the Holy Roman Emperor, and she gained a certain amount of experience, didn't she, of court politics, of dealing with powerful men and so on, of administration. It was a kind of a good grounding in a way, wasn't it?
It was, and she did. She acted as regent when Henry was away on campaign. She issued charters, resolved disputes between barons. One of the early disputes she resolved was actually with Godfrey of Louvain, who was the father of her future stepmother, Adeliza of Louvain, who married
Yeah,
Henry
Henry
the
I's
First.
second wife, wasn't she? Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
Empress Matilda and Adeliza of Louvain were very similar ages, so there's a possibility that they were friends. And Empress Matilda was the
yeah.
one who suggested the marriage to Henry I, because of course once William the Atheling had died, Henry needed an heir, so he married really quickly. William died in the November. Henry married Adeliza in the January. And he kept Adeliza with him everywhere. The poor woman was dragged around everywhere so that she was on hand whenever he felt the urge to try and produce a new heir. And unfortunately for both of them and for England in the end, when you think about it, no heir was forthcoming. Poor Adeliza got the blame, which probably wasn't her fault given that she had 7 children with her second husband. But this meant that Henry had to look around for a new heir. And until 1125, Empress Matilda wasn't available. Although she was his daughter, she was away in Germany, and it was expected that she would have children with her husband and that her life would be in Germany. So Henry seems to have started grooming his nephew Stephen of Blois for the throne, and he arranged for a very prestigious marriage to Matilda of Boulogne for Stephen, so that he had finances, title, and backing. And I think this is where the problem comes with Stephen. Henry sort of whispered to him, "You can be my heir." And then Emperor Henry dies, and suddenly Matilda's available. And so Henry's like, "Actually, Stephen, forget it. Matilda's coming home." And he recalls Empress Matilda immediately back to England and has Stephen and the rest of the barons swear an oath that they will support Empress Matilda as Henry's heir and the future Queen of
Yeah,
England.
I mean, basically, then Henry gets his nobility to swear an oath. I think he does it twice
Yeah, he
to
does.
accept Matilda as his successor. But there are always issues in the Middle Ages with handing power to a woman, and there
Yeah.
are what many of the nobles would have seen as practical issues, such as her ability to lead men in battle at a time when direct leadership in an active sense was often
Mm.
regarded as very important. So there were questions about that, but there was also a question about who she now married. Obviously, she was widowed, so it was important who she married as far as the barons were concerned, or as far as everyone was concerned, if she was going to be queen. And so
Yeah.
the choice of husband was a factor which affected how the English and Norman nobility regarded her, wasn't it?
Yeah, and swearing that first oath was on the proviso that they had a say in the
Yeah.
choice of husband that Matilda took. And in the end, Henry overrode them and decided for himself. And he decided on Geoffrey of Anjou. And this was a bit of an elaborate situation anyway, because Geoffrey wasn't Count of Anjou at the time. When they were thinking about it, he was a 13-year-old son of Fulk of Anjou, who had just been offered the throne of Jerusalem. So Fulk and Henry made this deal where Fulk would go and take the throne of Jerusalem by marrying Jerusalem's queen, and would cede his county of Anjou to Geoffrey straight away, so that Geoffrey would be Count of Anjou when he married Matilda. Now, the problem with Matilda marrying Geoffrey of Anjou, besides the fact she's 25 and he's 14, is that Anjou is the natural enemy of Normandy. So it put a lot of noses out of joint that Matilda would be married to Anjou, without the fact that, of course, that means that any child born from Matilda and Geoffrey would inherit England, Normandy, and Anjou and rule
Yeah, it's
all
probably
three.
worth reminding people that at this time, since the Norman conquest, basically England and Normandy are a kind of royal partnership, aren't they? The King of
Yeah,
England is also effectively the Duke of Normandy, and the English barons are effectively also Norman barons, or many of them are. So it's quite common,
Yes.
particularly among the prominent nobles, for them to have lands in both England and Normandy. That's kind of not expected, but it's very, very common.
It is indeed very common. You look at the Warrens, they had extensive lands in England, in Yorkshire, Surrey, and Norfolk, and they had Bellencombe and Mortimer in France.
Yeah.
The Beaumonts, the Earls of Leicester, luckily the last Earl of Leicester had twin sons as his eldest boys, so he had two heirs who were literally minutes apart. So one was given the title Earl of Leicester from the English lands, and the other was given the title of Count of Boulogne from their French lands. And they used to travel between England and Normandy all the time. You know, they saw the English Channel as a river they had to cross rather than a dividing line that we see it now.
It is perhaps quite hard to grasp how tightly enmeshed they all were in the two places. But obviously, marrying Geoffrey of Anjou, as you say, he is kind of a natural enemy of Normandy. And the Norman barons, or the English barons, Anglo-Norman barons, I think is the term we're supposed to use, they aren't keen on him being Matilda's husband if she is going to succeed to the throne when Henry dies. Obviously, nobody knows when. This is always the thing with succession, isn't it? Nobody actually knows when a king or queen, for that matter, is going to die. So people are sort of manoeuvring, really.
And the thing is, Henry was caught between a rock and a hard place when he chose Matilda's husband. The barons, although they didn't like Geoffrey, they would not have agreed to Henry choosing someone from within their own ranks, because that would mean that the barons who were equal to them, one of them would be put above them. So they didn't want that, but they didn't want Geoffrey either because he was a natural enemy. So I think Henry made the best choice available at the time.
We need to kind of explain why Matilda doesn't succeed. Henry dies towards the end of 1135, and as it happens, when he dies, Matilda is not in the best place to make a bid for the throne. She probably assumes that she will be accepted as queen, but she is in no position to do anything about it. Because at the time, I think she's in the middle of she's either, is she pregnant or is she just given birth? Yeah, true. Yes.
She had just recently given birth to her middle son, Geoffrey, and she'd almost died in the process and taken a long time to recover from that. And then found herself 2 or 3 months pregnant when her dad died with her final son, William. So she wasn't in a position to act. As you say, these barons had sworn oath to her twice. So she just assumed, probably, that when Henry died, it would be announced that she was the ruler.
Yeah.
And one argument is that the barons had sworn to accept Empress Matilda, but then they'd also had the caveat that they had the choice of husband, and then Henry foisted Geoffrey on them. But that doesn't stand up to the argument that there was then a later oath after she'd married Geoffrey, and they again swore to uphold Matilda's claim to the throne. So when in December 1135, Henry dies, Stephen isn't there, neither is Empress Matilda, because Empress Matilda is back in Anjou, pregnant. Stephen is in Boulogne with his wife, who's also pregnant, and Henry dies surrounded by something like 5 or 6 earls. One of these earls is the Earl of Norfolk. It's either Hugh Bigod or Roger Bigod.
Hugh, isn't it?
I think it's Hugh. And he swore that on his deathbed, Henry I disinherited Matilda and left the throne to Stephen. Now, given there were 5 or 6 earls there, he's the only one who says this. None of the others actually say that this happened.
They don't deny it happened. They don't say it didn't happen, do they?
No, they don't deny it, and they don't act against Stephen. In fact, when they escort King Henry's body back to England, first or second stop is in Rouen, where William de Warenne, the Earl Warenne, leaves the cortege to take control of Normandy in Stephen's name. And by this point, Stephen has already managed to hop on a ship. Remember, he's married to the Countess of Boulogne, and they are a maritime nation, very big on trade, and got loads of ships ready and waiting for Stephen to hop on a ship, make it to England, jump on a horse, get to Westminster, and be crowned before Christmas Day. Given that Henry only died on the 1st of December, Stephen is crowned on the 22nd of December. Stephen was ready and waiting, and I think that's why he was at Boulogne rather than
The
with
funny
Henry.
thing is, though, that if you're let's say you're an Anglo-Norman baron in December and you're thinking, okay, what happens now? The actual situation that Matilda's in bears out what you've long believed, that she isn't able, because she's a woman, circumstances have come about that means she can't actually go and take the throne. So in other words, many Anglo-Norman barons would be saying, well, exactly, this is what we thought would happen. And they feel that, well, it can't be her. She's kind of failed at the first hurdle. But they're not necessarily all thinking of Stephen, are they? Because some suggest his brother, Theobald of Blois.
Yeah, the Normans actually pick Theobald. And they have this big meeting and they decide Theobald is going to be Duke of Normandy and they'll propose him as King of England as well. But by this point, they get a message to say that actually Stephen's been crowned King of England.
The post is no longer vacant.
Yeah. Now, I know what you're saying about Empress Matilda, but even pregnant, she would have been able to travel. It's just she would have taken a little while to get organised and to travel. I mean, this was a formidable woman who can escape from castles in a snowstorm.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you're an Anglo-Norman baron who didn't really want to swear an oath to Matilda anyway, you're saying, well, we had doubts, and sure enough, she's slow off the mark. So that proves it, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the thing is, though, you look at 1154 when King Stephen died and Henry has to get over to England to claim the throne. He doesn't hop on a ship straight away because he doesn't have to. He knows that the throne is his and nobody's going to oppose it. So Empress Matilda in 1135 may have thought everybody's already sworn an oath. And oaths were incredibly binding in those days. And probably thought that she had time to arrange things before moving to London.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely the case. I'm sure she assumed, being the kind of character she was, I'm sure she assumed that it was all just going to happen for her. But as you said earlier, maybe in a sense, Henry I had kind of set Stephen up to believe that there was a jolly good chance that he could be king. And he probably thought, well, let's go for it.
Yeah, and I think Stephen had spent years leading up to Henry I's death when it was obvious there was going to be no male heir. I think Stephen had spent the time building bridges and alliances and saying to the barons when they were meeting, look, lads, we don't really want a woman because if we have Empress Matilda, and this was their big worry, then we also have Geoffrey of Anjou. Because in those days, once a woman was married, it was the man who owned all her property. That was decided through hereditary rights on land rule. If an heiress married an earl, the earl got the heiress's lands, and that was it. He managed those lands as his own. And the barons feared that if Empress Matilda got the crown, then Geoffrey would treat it as his own.
Well, then they never had a queen, had they? There'd not been a queen.
Yeah, it had never actually been decided how a woman would rule and whether or not she would rule in her own name, because the question had never come up before except once. And I will mention the once, which is Lady Ethelfled, who was Lady of the Mercians and ruled in her own name.
Okay, so basically, Stephen's on the throne from the end of 1135 onwards, and for a year or two, Matilda appears to, if not accept that fact, she accepts the situation she's in.
Yeah, she doesn't really have a choice. All but one Anglo-Norman baron swears fealty to Stephen. And it's only when the barons suddenly realise that Stephen might not be exactly the most capable man for the job that chinks appear in his support.
But I don't think they really decide that before Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who is an illegitimate son of Henry I, who is Matilda's half brother, therefore. and during Henry's reign was extremely prominent, very, very important man in the kingdom. Now he goes along with Stephen's accession for a year or two, but in 1138 he decides to declare for Matilda. Now we won't go into all the reasons for that now because it's not really the focus of what we're talking about. But basically, had he not declared for Matilda in 1138, I don't think she would ever have got anywhere near the throne of England.
No, probably not. Because like you say, Robert wasn't just a prominent noble. When they swore fealty to Empress Matilda, to support Empress Matilda's claim, the future King Stephen and Robert, Earl of Gloucester, were the two leading nobles who were jostling for position to be the first to swear allegiance. They almost got into fisticuffs. Some sources say each was trying to be the first, and other sources say that they were being too gentlemanly, and each was trying to make the other one be the
Oh, well,
first.
it's all about interpretation, isn't it?
But that just shows how prominent Robert was.
Yeah. So basically, Matilda from 1138 has a chance of perhaps getting back what she would have regarded as her right. Now, let's have a look, shall we, at Geoffrey of Anjou, because clearly he's her husband and he's a lot younger than she is, as you said. But he presumably is going to have considerable influence on her cause. Is he a help or a hindrance to the Empress, do you think?
Geoffrey was only interested in Normandy. The Anglo-Norman barons should never have had to worry about Geoffrey having any slight interest in England. He was interested in Normandy, and that's where he put all his talents. We always say that the anarchy started when Robert renounced his allegiance to Stephen and told Empress Matilda, I'm on your side, and she lands at Arundel. And that's the start of the anarchy. The anarchy had already started by this point. Geoffrey had invaded Normandy in 1136, 1137, and started taking castles. Stephen had led an expedition, a disastrous expedition to Normandy in 1137, where he'd taken all the young barons with him, and none of them were interested in actually fighting. So they eventually came home. Geoffrey wasn't interested in England, but he was very much interested in Normandy. In 1142, Empress Matilda applies to Geoffrey for reinforcements, and Geoffrey says to her, right, I will send you something, but you've got to send Robert, your brother, over to negotiate for these reinforcements. So Robert goes because there's a lull in the fighting in England, and he knows that reinforcements from Geoffrey will be very helpful. He goes over to Normandy, and Geoffrey has him campaigning with him for months, taking castle after castle, but not sending any reinforcements to Matilda. And eventually Robert comes home with no reinforcements, but he has helped Geoffrey take over most of Normandy.
This whole idea of Geoffrey wanting Normandy is quite interesting, because on the one hand, you could argue, as you just have in a sense, that his focus is on Normandy, therefore he's not helping Matilda to take England. But the disruption he causes in Normandy does weaken some of those who are most loyal to Stephen. It is a sideshow in a way, but it's a crucially important sideshow.
It is, because the barons can't just concentrate on England. They've got all their lands in Normandy as well. So they've got to have enough of their people in Normandy to keep their lands in Normandy safe while they're keeping their lands in England safe. So it's splitting the forces.
I think, to be fair to Geoffrey, if you look at things from his perspective, he's married this older woman. Now, obviously, they do have a number of children together, so the marriage is successful in that sense. And she's obviously a good catch for him. She's the Empress Matilda. So from his point of view, that's all good. But his interest in Normandy doesn't begin with his marriage to Matilda. Anjou has got an interest in Normandy long before that, and is at odds with Henry I over Normandy and the borderlands between them. So I guess from his point of view, he's just doing what a Count of Anjou should be doing.
Yeah. And this is one of my arguments about, when they say they didn't want Empress Matilda because of her husband, because he was the Count of Anjou and everybody hated Anjou. And that was it. It wasn't because she was a woman and he'd take over, but it was because he was Count of Anjou and they didn't like Anjou. But Matilda's brother, William the athlete, had also been married to another Matilda of Anjou, Geoffrey's older sister. So we don't mind William marrying a daughter from Anjou. We just don't want Matilda to marry a man from Anjou.
I guess, though, in a way, he does do the one thing that any person wanting to be the ruling monarch needs. He gives her an heir. In fact, he gives her several heirs. In fact, he gives her too many heirs. But the eldest heir is, of course, Henry, who becomes Henry II later on. And he does go to England.
And it's noticeable, actually, how Henry thinks and how much he appreciates his mother's struggle, because he identifies himself not as Henry of Anjou, but as Henry Fitz-Empress, Henry the son of the Empress, because he knows that that's where his claim to England lies.
That's very significant, I think, and he does that from quite a relatively early age. And he does come to England, and he is involved, perhaps on the periphery, but he is involved from quite an early age in her cause.
Yeah, he comes over first in 1142. When Robert comes back from Normandy after taking a few castles with Geoffrey, he brings Henry with him and installs him in Bristol Castle and has him educated alongside his own children. And Henry's about, what would he be, 10 at the time? 9 or 10? So I think that's a significant symbol. He's brought Henry over to show the Empress's side and Stephen's side who the Empress is fighting for, and it changes the focus. It's Henry's inheritance that she's fighting to recover.
One of the most important things for any king is to say, there's the future, there's the heir, there's security. You know, everybody who supports me can see that there is a way forward, and Henry is the way forward. And of course, he was pretty smart, because he was the great beneficiary of the whole anarchy. Really, he came out of it as king. So Geoffrey, we think, wasn't entirely bad news for Matilda, whilst he didn't give direct armed support, which might actually have changed the course of things a bit.
It should also be noted in support of Geoffrey for the fact that he did take Normandy. He was recognised as Duke of Normandy, and yet after a couple of years, he resigned the duchy to Henry before he died. Henry inherited Normandy before Geoffrey died. So Geoffrey, as well as the Empress, were looking to the future. And he was looking to the fact that Henry needed the Duchy of Normandy to bolster his position against England.
Okay, so we've looked at the Empress Matilda's other half, Geoffrey. What about Stephen's other half, the other Matilda of Boulogne? What was her role in Stephen's kingship, do you think?
I think it was essential. She was a really big part of Stephen's kingship, and I think analysis of her role has been highly underrated through the years. In 1138, there was a battle at Northallerton called the Battle of the Standard, between the forces of King Stephen, led by the Archbishop of York and Bishop of Durham, and King David of Scots and his son Henry, Earl of Huntingdon. And the Scots lost, although Henry, the young prince, distinguished himself in the battle. But the Scots lost. And it was Matilda of Boulogne who went north to Durham to negotiate the treaty between the two sides. She negotiated a very favourable treaty for the Scots, which might suggest that she was a little too soft. But what they were trying to do was get the Scots on side, because David, King of Scots, was a son of Margaret of Wessex. So he was therefore the uncle of Empress Matilda and Matilda of Boulogne. And yes, he was probably invading in 1138 to support Empress Matilda's cause, but he was also invading out of self-interest. Unrest in England was good news for Scotland, because it meant, first, the English weren't looking north to invade Scotland, which was always a nice reprieve. And secondly, they could cause trouble. So David had come south to Northallerton to take advantage of the situation in England. Now, the Treaty of Durham was to ensure that the Scots stayed at least neutral in the forthcoming war in England. And they arranged for a marriage. Stephen didn't have any daughters old enough to marry, but the Earls of Warren and Leicester and the Count of Milan, who were half-brothers had a sister named Ada de Warren, who was old enough. So, and apparently she and Henry, according to Audric Vitalis, it was a love match that just happened about the same time as the Treaty
Just
of
a
Durham.
coincidence.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they were introduced and they had this idea that there was a marriage, and Henry and Ada looked into each other's eyes and went, yes, please.
There's a novel in there somewhere.
Yeah. And Matilda of Boulogne was instrumental in the Treaty of Durham that arranged the marriage of Prince Henry. This marriage also was from where all the descendants to the Scottish throne come from, including the current King Charles III. The whole line from the Scottish throne down to the current British king descended from Ada de Warren and Henry. And it's from them that all the competitors during the late 14th century, when Robert the Bruce emerged triumphant, all the competitors for the Scottish throne then were descended from Ada de Warren.
Too many
Henry.
children, that's the problem. It's always the problem, too many children. Okay, so Matilda of Boulogne then clearly had the trust of Stephen. We should maybe explain that the reason Stephen wasn't at the Battle of the Standard and wasn't negotiating with the Scots was not that he couldn't be bothered, but that he was mopping up opposition in the southwest, particularly of England. Some of the allies of Robert Earl of Gloucester had risen in revolt, pockets of revolt. So Stephen was working his way around and taking castles and crushing minor revolts. They were minor revolts, but obviously if he left them to fester, they could be the beginnings of a large uprising against him. So he was doing what he needed to do to secure the kingdom, but his wife was also doing what he needed her to do in the north.
Yeah. Well, as a choice of negotiator, it was very politically astute. She was David's niece, so she could pull on the heartstrings with David, whereas Stephen had no relationship with him. So it was quite an astute choice of negotiator, and she did do well. And that was just one of the things she did. She was always, I just think of her as Stephen's backbone.
I agree with you, but I think that's kind of unfair to Stephen. Okay, so Matilda of Boulogne is doing a good job supporting her husband in a big way. We've got the Empress Matilda landing in England in summer of 1139 with her half-brother Robert Earl of Gloucester, and not that many men with her.
I think it's 300 knights.
I'm not even sure it's as many as that, is it? Anyway, it's not very many. And she lands at Arundel. Stephen has got the major ports watched, so he's expecting she may be arriving. He's probably not expecting her to turn up in Arundel, which is it's not really a port, let alone a major port. But it does happen to have a very, very good castle, a very secure castle, in which is Adeliza de Louvain, the aforementioned second wife of Henry I, who we said might well have a connection with the Empress Matilda. So the Empress Matilda turns up in England, not with a big invasion force at all, but she's there. And by hook or by crook, well, actually, because King Stephen lets her, she goes to Bristol, which is where Robert Earl of Gloucester's power base is. She's in England, her resources are limited, and most of the Anglo-Norman barons are on King Stephen's side. Is that a fair assessment, do you think, at that point, around about 1140-ish?
Why King Stephen actually lets her leave Arundel and go to Bristol is...
He's a nice chap. He's a nice chap. He's a gentleman.
Yeah, it just beggars belief. But it's like he won't make war on a woman or something like that. He's being chivalrous.
Don't make war on a woman, but it's a woman that's actually trying to take your throne. So that is a bit odd, but I suppose it also suggests, I think this is certainly true, that he underestimates the Empress Matilda, and he thinks that, the force she's got with her, he's probably breathing a sigh of relief, to be honest, because he's thinking, well, yeah, okay, so she's in the country, but there's no way she could possibly unseat me from the throne with a force that small.
Yeah, and she's only got her brother, and who was the other one? Baldwin the Redfus.
Yeah, Baldwin the Redfus. He's worth a podcast on his own, Baldwin the Redfus. And we must do that sometime. But she's got very few sort of publicly supporting her, and really none of the other important Anglo-Norman barons, except her half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester. So how is it then that if that's the situation in 1140-ish, how is it that in 1141, the Empress Matilda almost won? She almost gained the throne.
Well, my argument is that she actually did win for a time. But yeah, the thing was, there was this little incident at Lincoln. Now, Lincoln Castle had a sort of joint ownership agreement. The Bishop of Lincoln, the King of England, and the Earl of Lincoln all had interest in Lincoln Castle. Just before the Anarchy, the Earldom of Lincoln had belonged to Lucy of Bolingbroke, and she had two sons by two different husbands, William de Roumer and Ranulph, Earl of Chester. Roumer was the elder and wanted the Earldom of Lincoln. The two brothers decided that the way to do this was to get hold of Lincoln Castle. So one day, the Lincoln Castle constable went out hunting with most of his garrison. As you do. And the brothers sent their wives in to visit the constable's wife and, take afternoon tea and all that kind of thing and have a natter. You do ladies' things and we'll come back later and pick you up. And when they came back to pick up their wife, they had a couple of men-at-arms with them, to make sure they were safe walking through Lincoln, were allowed into the castle to collect their wives, disarmed the blokes on the gate. So they opened the gate so the rest of their men could come into the castle and basically took over the castle because there was just a skeleton garrison because the rest of them had gone out hunting, and took over Lincoln Castle. And it was sort of a private feud at that moment that the brothers wanted their castle back. But the people of Lincoln then sent to the king and said, the Earl of Chester's just stolen the castle. You need to come and get it back. We don't want him. And so Stephen marches up to Lincoln to try and take the castle, which means that the Earl of Chester, who had been on Stephen's side...
Yeah, that's the critical thing, isn't it, really?
Well, he also had wanted the Earldom of Cumbria. He wanted Cumbria, but that had been given to Prince Henry of Scotland in the 1139 Treaty of Durham. So he'd already been disappointed in not getting Cumbria, and now he wanted Lincoln Castle. And so Stephen wasn't being the lord he wanted Stephen to be by not giving him everything he wanted. When Stephen came up to Lincoln, he snuck out of the castle, went to Robert of Gloucester, who just happens to be his father-in-law, and says, Robert, my wife, your daughter, is stuck in Lincoln Castle and Stephen's besieging her, and we need to get her out. If I join the Empress's side, will you march up there with me and give Stephen a rollicking? And that's what they did. But they got to Lincoln by the 2nd of February, and the pitched battle that followed saw Stephen captured and Robert of Gloucester and the Earl of Chester triumphant. A lot of the English barons fighting on Stephen's side ran away, which makes them sound like cowards, but that wasn't the case, really. It was that they didn't want to be captured and held for ransom. Because in those days, you didn't kill a baron, you captured him, and you held it. You could get a lot of money, and a lot of barons were actually bankrupted from being caught in battle.
It's a bit odd that in modern times, if people don't stay and fight to the end, or the death, or whatever, or capture, we say, oh, well, they're cowards. If they do stay and fight and they get killed, we say, well, that was stupid because there's no one left to support him now. So you can't really win when hindsight is examining what you did a long time ago. So basically, the capture of Stephen gifted Matilda an absolute golden opportunity to be queen. She was pretty much on the road to being queen, and in fact, a number of churchmen had accepted, leading churchmen had accepted that she was going to be queen. Well, I'm not sure they weren't too sure whether they were going to call her queen or not, I don't think.
You see, this is where my argument is. She was proclaimed Lady of the English. And I think that was probably, as far as everyone was concerned in those days, the equivalent title for a woman to King of England. Because the only other female ruler we'd ever had was Ethelfled, who was proclaimed Lady of the Mercians. So in proclaiming her Lady of the English, they were harking back to the one ruler
They're
they knew
also
of.
distinguishing between a queen who was the wife of a king, like Matilda of Boulogne, and a ruler in her own right, who was
Exactly.
Lady of the English.
Yeah, because in those days, they didn't have the title
No.
for a woman who would rule. Yes, we use queen now, but in those days, the queen was the wife of the king. I mean, you just have to look at Poland in the 14th century when they had Jadwiga, their first female ruler. They didn't have a name for a queen, so they called her King Jadwiga.
Very confusing.
Well, you know, if they'd named her queen, then also would they have had to name Geoffrey King? So by naming her Lady of the English, they gave her the most senior title they could give to a woman that was independent of any man.
So why didn't she win though? Why didn't she follow through on this victory after Lincoln? How do you see that?
That was Matilda of Boulogne's fault.
That's the other Matilda that we're talking about. So
yes, ordinarily you look at it, the king's been captured, so she's won. But Matilda of Boulogne doesn't just sit back and go, oh, well, Stephen's been captured. I'd better go and join a nunnery or something. And this shows exactly also how much of Stephen's resources came from Matilda. Because Stephen's leading general, mercenary general, was William of Ypres, who was from the county of Boulogne and a distant relative of Matilda. And she used William of Ypres throughout 1141 to lead the forces while she was actually leading the negotiations. And she did start with sending letters to the church council that convened to declare Empress Matilda Lady of the English. First of all, she sent a letter saying that Stephen should be restored to the throne, and they ignored that. Then they sent a letter saying, release Stephen and I'll take him to the continent into exile or to join a monastery or something, and they rejected that. And she sent another letter then, and this is one that I find really annoying, saying that, all right, can you just at least guarantee that our eldest son Eustace will inherit our hereditary land, Stephen's county of Mortagne and Matilda of Boulogne's county of Boulogne? And Empress Matilda refuses. And apparently this puts some of the barons' backs up who are supporting Matilda, because if their inheritance isn't guaranteed to their son, then the whole feudal society breaks down. And that's what they worry about. If she's going to stop Eustace from inheriting Stephen's lands, then who else can she stop from inheriting their father's lands? The irony, of course, being that they had all stopped Henry, Empress Matilda's son, from inheriting his mother's land and his grandfather's land. So they'd already usurped the hereditary principles, and now they're complaining that she's doing
I think this is one of those situations where, again, the Empress Matilda couldn't win, because if she allowed Eustace to be able to inherit all those lands and income, she created for the future a potential enemy, someone who was the son of King Stephen and may well feel, therefore, that he had a perfect right to take the throne of England. So if she did that, people would surely now see that as a mistake. On the other hand, by refusing, as you say, she maybe puts doubts in the minds of some of the barons that she may not allow them to pass on their lands to their children. But so I mean, basically, Matilda of Boulogne sort of keeps the flame burning, doesn't she? But she does a bit more than that, really. She goes on the offensive a bit.
Yeah, Empress Matilda has a magnificent Easter court at Oxford, and then makes her way to London, where she's sitting in the Palace of Westminster waiting her coronation. She's upset some Londoners by refusing to guarantee their traditional rights. As a result, they've been talking to Matilda of Boulogne. And as Empress Matilda has sat down to dinner, the bells ring out in the city of London in a prearranged signal, where the Londoners start rioting, and Matilda of Boulogne, who has just brought up her army under William of Ypres, is attacking from the outside. And Empress Matilda and her people have to flee London, have to flee west, basically leaving the dinner on the table. and all their baggage. They basically run for their lives because there's a mob rioting outside the door and an army approaching the walls. And they campaign throughout the summer. Henry of Blois, King Stephen's brother, who was Bishop of Winchester and instrumental in naming her as Lady of the English, decides this is the point where he really should go back to his brother's side and deserts Empress Matilda and goes back to Matilda of Boulogne, grovels quite a bit, I should think, in apology. Probably uses the fact that he's a priest and that he's only doing what's right for England to try and get back on her side. In the meantime, Empress Matilda besieges his castle at Winchester, even though he's not there. And as she's besieging his castle at Winchester, Matilda of Boulogne comes up from Kent to attack her, and the Londoners come down from London. So she's being approached from the east and the north by the enemy. Winchester's set on fire, and they literally cannot hold their defence and attack at the same time. So they're attacking a castle and having to defend from the Queen's forces. So they have to flee west. And in fleeing west, Robert of Gloucester leads the rear guard so that the Empress can get away. Unfortunately, he then gets captured in the fighting. So we now have Stephen in the hands of Empress Matilda, basically in the custody of Earl Robert's wife, and Earl Robert in the hands of Matilda of Boulogne. And Empress Matilda in dire straits because while Matilda of Boulogne needs her husband back, she's still got an army general in William of Ypres. She just doesn't have the figurehead. Empress Matilda has lost her leading general, the one man who can lead all her armies. He's basically her right hand because she can't fight. She needs him.
And I think also right from the start, a lot of the people fighting for her are not connected to her, they're connected to him. They have links to him either through marriages or land ownership or whatever. But, the leading supporters, many of them, we mentioned Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who had changed sides. Again, he had a link by marriage to Robert's family. So Empress Matilda herself doesn't have many of those connections because if we think she's been in Germany, she's been in Anjou. She hasn't got those personal connections and family connections that Robert of Gloucester has. So it's not just losing her general, it's losing the man that has really created her side.
Well, if you look at where her power base is, which is in the southwest, it's not her power base, it's Robert's.
So, effectively, to cut a bit of a long story short, they exchange the two leading men. And so we are sort of back to square one.
Back to how they were at Christmas 1140. Christmas 1141, Stephen's on the throne. He has this great crown-wearing ceremony at Canterbury Cathedral to prove he's still king or back as king, depending on whether you accept that Matilda being declared Lady of the English means she is declared queen. So he is back on the throne and everyone's back where they were in January, and Empress Matilda licking her wounds and Stephen also licking his wounds.
Yeah, it is back to that sort of political state of 1140, but I don't think it's quite the same situation. I think Matilda's sort of brief foray to power almost has maybe elevated her in the eyes of some people who perhaps previously were not sure about her. And Stephen, his failure at Lincoln and maybe has been made to look perhaps not so effective. So I think there is a slight shift in terms of how they are both regarded.
And 1142, you read about Stephen having some kind of health issue, possibly a mental breakdown from his captivity. And Empress Matilda's son is brought to England for the first time. This is the point where she's suddenly changing the focus from 1142 onwards, not to Empress Matilda wanting the crown, but to her fighting on so that her son gets the crown.
I mean, one thing that we've only not even slightly touched on is that in this period of the anarchy and the struggle between Empress Matilda and Stephen, we've basically shown two sides, but actually there's a third side in this whole conflict, as there there always was in this period, and that's the church. And we are heading towards that period where there is going to be a showdown, notably between the future Henry II and the church. It is an issue for several hundred years. Where do the rights of the state end and the rights of the church begin, and vice versa? So, in a sense, this period is also played out with the church as a major player in the game.
It is. Stephen actually wrote to the Pope to justify his claiming of the throne, saying that his oath to Empress Matilda wasn't valid because he'd been forced to make it. And Empress Matilda had also sent letters to the Pope asking him to support her claim. The problem was Stephen was by that point crowned and anointed, and as far as the church was concerned, anointing a king, it was irreversible.
It's God's approval in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, and while there is all this fighting going on in England, it's often overlooked that there was a court case going on at the Vatican with the Pope trying to adjudicate between the two. And there's all these arguments and letters going forward with both parties putting their case. And then you also have Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, who's Stephen's brother. But when Matilda claims the throne in 1141, he accepts it as a fait accompli and names her Lady of the English. And he's really influential throughout the Anarchy in choosing sides and deciding what's going on.
But there's a problem before that, isn't there, with Roger of Salisbury and his two nephew bishops. Roger of Salisbury is Bishop of Salisbury, but two of his nephews were also prominent bishops. Roger of Salisbury particularly more or less ran Henry I's administration, didn't he? I mean, churchmen often did. It's not unusual in this time period. So Roger of Salisbury would have seen himself as a bit of a power broker probably when Henry I died. And initially he acquiesces in Stephen's accession, as do the other bishops. But there is an issue which comes up in 1139, I think it is, where Stephen arrests Roger of Salisbury and his two nephews, the bishops of Ely and Lincoln, I think. So Stephen believes that in 1139, those bishops are at the very least trying to undermine his authority, and at the very most are siding with the Empress Matilda, who, of course, is just arriving in England. So the church is a player in the game. I mean, obviously, those are only three bishops, but their arrest is significant because it creates a bit of a political issue. Can the king arrest these bishops? Are they subject to his authority? And now the idea of a bishop, it's not a spiritual thing, really. I mean, for Roger of Salisbury, he's more of a political animal than a religious one. These bishops own castles. In some cases, they're like palaces. They're very, very wealthy in many cases and very influential, like barons. They are essentially church barons. So on the one hand, they have a political role, and the state, in this case, Stephen, wants to regulate that and control that and wants them to be politically loyal to him. But on the other hand, they have allegiance to the Pope and the church. And they have rights under canon law, under church law, and they're not, in theory, subject to the common law. They're not subject to royal authority. So this whole issue blows up a bit and undermines Stephen's support, I think, from some of the bishops who are forced to choose, in a sense, is it right that he's arresting bishops?
And I think that is something that really comes to light in the next reign with Henry II and Thomas Becket. Well, it all stems from this and from Henry I. There is this long-running argument in the 12th century as to who has the power even to make a bishop.
And appoint archbishops.
Yeah, it just shows how influential the church was. I mean, in 1138, at the Battle of the Standard, the English side was led by the Bishop of Durham, the Archbishop of York. They weren't purely spiritual men in those days.
No, not at all.
They went where the influence was biggest.
It kind of doesn't make much sense to us in the 21st century, but that's how it was. And most people have probably heard of Henry II and Thomas Becket, but that is kind of the climax. The previous sort of 100 years or so is building up to that. It's not a personal thing just about Henry II and Becket, it's a political issue with the church that's been going on for a very long time. Obviously, at a time where you've got a conflict as to who should be the ruler of the country, that's a moment when the church is going to be involved, and inevitably it's a moment when this conflict of church versus state is going to be quite important.
Yeah, and I think that's significant in the early 1150s when Stephen's getting older. Empress Matilda has returned to Normandy, and Henry Fitz-Empress has come over and taken up the charge, basically. But at the same time, Stephen has applied to the Pope to have his son, Eustace, his oldest son, crowned in his lifetime. It's not something that ever happened in England, except the ones in the next reign with Henry II having Henry the Young King crowned. But it was something that happened on the continent. And Stephen wanted to do it to guarantee Eustace's succession. He was the first king in what he hoped would be a dynasty. And having had the Pope's backing throughout the war, he probably assumed it was just a formality, and the Pope would say, yep, go ahead, we'll guarantee Eustace gets crowned. But the Pope's stance on Stephen has changed by this point.
Yeah.
They've begun to realise that Stephen has lied to them about the oaths in the beginning of the reign, and that Henry Fitz-Empress is the heir to Henry I. So they don't want to guarantee Eustace's succession because that's diverting the succession. With Stephen, they could accept it because he was a bloke and therefore more right to be king than the emperor. But it was time to redirect the crown to the right.
Yeah, I mean, Henry was the grandson of Henry I in direct line. So he had a very good claim to the throne. But the other thing about young Henry is he was clever. And he was building relationships with many of the leading barons and churchmen. So he wasn't just sitting around waiting to be offered the crown. He was actively promoting himself as the best successor to Stephen, rather than someone who was still fighting Stephen for the throne. He was presenting himself as almost the peace candidate, really.
And it didn't hurt him that Eustace, he wasn't the most admired of young men. He'd made some bad choices, raided monasteries, things like that, mistreated his wife. Nobody looked up to him. So while you've got Henry making friends, Eustace was making enemies. As I say, the Pope was saying, no, you're not going to crown Eustace in his own lifetime. And I think it was Matilda of Boulogne who had pushed for that. Her health was beginning to fail. And I think she was trying to guarantee what would happen after Stephen by getting Eustace crowned, to guarantee the succession and to make sure that what they'd done for the last 20 years wasn't undone. But it didn't work. She then dies in 1152 and Eustace dies in 1153, which actually paves the way for Stephen to make this agreement with Henry Fitz-Empress that Stephen continues as king as long as he lives, but he adopts Henry as his son and heir, basically disinheriting his younger son William. And I do think that he would never have done that if Matilda of Boulogne was alive. I don't think Matilda of Boulogne would have allowed him to disinherit.
So why do you think he did that then? Was he not well and he was getting older and just said enough of this?
He wasn't well, having lost Matilda of Boulogne and Eustace within 12 months of each other. And the barons, they'd had 19 years of war. They didn't want it to continue. William was only 17 or something when his dad died.
Yeah, in his teens, wasn't he? Yeah.
To be fair, Henry wasn't much older, but he was miles more experienced. The deal was with the Treaty of Winchester that Henry would be recognised as Stephen's heir, but William would be bought off with becoming the richest and most powerful landowner in the country.
It was compensated.
Yeah, he was allowed to inherit all Stephen's lands and the county of Boulogne, which I think Henry himself agreed with at the time, but knew that as soon as Stephen was gone, that wasn't going to remain the case.
Yeah. What's interesting in a way is that in the end, we've been talking about Matilda of Boulogne and the Empress Matilda, but it was their sons, in a sense, that are the end product of all this. And of those sons, if we talk of Eustace rather than William, if you look at it from the point of view of the Anglo-Norman barons, they're saying, okay, which of these guys offers us the best deal, the best chance of peace, prosperity? Because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, whilst they were all out for what they could get individually, it was in nobody's interest really for there to be a long, drawn out period of war. They'd had
No.
this war, the long kind of stalemate, and it wasn't a happy stalemate particularly. So they're looking
No.
at Henry and saying, well, yeah, he conducts himself like a potential king, so let's go with that.
You can understand it if you just read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles comment on it. Never did a country endure greater misery. Wherever the earth was tilled, the earth bore no corn, and men said that Christ and his saints slept. It had been a devastating time for England. I don't think it had been as devastating as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles
No,
make out.
they were a bit susceptible to hyperbole, I think, and exaggeration. I think if there had been no crops grown at all,
Yeah.
they'd all have died. So
19 years of warfare from Scotland to Anjou, every area had been touched by warfare at
yeah,
some
I think
point.
that's true. I think it wasn't just certain areas, although obviously the southwest and Kent and the Midlands were the main areas, and we said earlier Lincoln. So it's heavily towards the south of England, I think, was where most of the altercations took place. But I don't think after the Empress Matilda left England, there wasn't a great deal of hostile actions going on. It was just a kind of hostile stalemate as people jockeyed for position.
She left England in 1148, I
Not
think
long
it
after
was.
Robert of Gloucester had died.
Yeah, Robert of Gloucester died. A whole load of barons went on
As you do.
crusade. They called the Second Crusade in 1147. A whole load of barons went, stuff this for a game of soldiers. I'm off crusading.
Yeah,
The old guard had gone, and Stephen was left with the young guard to carry on the fight against Henry, who was taking castles from Scotland to Warwick and getting knighted by, I think it's significant that he's knighted by his uncle David, King of Scots, who'd been supporting the Empress from practically the
yeah,
very beginning. So there
yeah.
is this change from 1147 onwards, where the barons remaining are making treaties between themselves to look after each other's lands. If your land is attacked, I will help you, and things like, mutual support treaties. So the actual nature of the war
Yeah.
changes. It just looks like everybody's
I think
tired of
that's
it.
more than likely the case. The only thing I would say is we've kind of made a case for Matilda of Boulogne as a strong, capable woman. We kind
Mm-hmm.
of haven't made that case for Empress Matilda, really. We've actually done the opposite in a way. We've suggested that, well, her support's all down to Robert of Gloucester and this, that, and the other. So maybe we ought to extol her virtues a little bit and balance the equation and say what she had.
I think it's the male-dominated
Mm,
world. Matilda of Boulogne appears as the more acceptable woman of the age because she's fighting for her husband and her son to keep their rights in
she's the
place.
acceptable face of womanhood in the Middle Ages.
Yes, she doesn't overstep what she's supposed to do. Whereas Empress Matilda, certainly until 1142, is fighting for
Mm,
her rights. She's fighting for her crown. And that grates on people. And she hasn't got her husband there. She is
yeah,
the figurehead. I think she was an incredibly strong woman. She was incredibly brave. She escaped from Oxford Castle by either being lowered down the side of the keep or through a postern gate, depends which chronicle you read, in the dead of night in a snowstorm, dressed in white, and sneaks through Stephen's
mm.
army to get to safety. This is a woman who her personal courage is
Well, it's not in
incredible.
doubt, is it? Her personal courage is not in doubt, and her strength of character is not in doubt.
Yeah, it's just her judgment is
Yeah,
questioned. And the one that always grates on me is she is holding court and she's sat on the equivalent of a throne. And her brother and her uncle enter the room. Her uncle David, King of Scots, and her brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester. At this point, she has been named Lady of the English. She's technically in charge of England. And when her uncle enters the room and her brother, she doesn't stand. And the chronicles, especially the deeds of Stephen, says how horrendous this is, that she doesn't stand when her uncle David, the King of Scots, enters the room, because they are noble men who a woman should
mm,
stand for. Except Henry I, her father, would not have stood when David, King of Scots,
No.
entered the room. And if she is in the position that was once her father's, why should she do that if her father
You
didn't?
mentioned the Chronicles a number of times, and I think we have to accept that almost everything we know about the period comes from several chronicles written either at the time or shortly afterwards. And pretty much without exception, those reflect the view of the time of a woman's place and how a woman should act. And let's just clarify, we're not talking about the male view. We're talking about everybody's view, men and women, the accepted view
Yeah, it's the accepted
of
view.
how a woman should be involved in government. She should be involved like Matilda of Boulogne, supporting her husband, making peace with people, solving problems of that sort, managing in his absence his estates or whatever. That's what the woman of the time should be doing. Matilda is in a position of command, and that is something that they find very difficult because, as we've said several times, it's pretty much unique in English history up to that point. We've mentioned Ethelflaed, but she wasn't Lady of the English. It wasn't that big. It wasn't a huge job like Matilda is going for. So yeah, she's in a position of command, and nobody really feels comfortable with that. And I think that's where the essence of the traditional views of Matilda come from, because those views are born in those chronicles.
Yeah, she was a woman before her time,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. She didn't win, but she did.
Yes. Yeah. It was her son who inherited
Yeah.
the throne and founded the Angevin dynasty and an even greater empire than the Anglo-Norman one. You know, when Henry II came to the throne, the Angevin Empire, the English Empire, was from the border of Scotland to the borders
In
with
that
Spain.
sense, the Empress Matilda won. But both women were terrific, I think. Both women were good examples of what a woman could do in a man's world in their own different way.
I think we have done both of them justice. Thank you very much for listening. Do join us next time when we will be welcoming Carol McGrath to A Slice of Medieval to discuss probably England's least known medieval queen, Berengaria of Navarre. She's very much a shadow on English history, the poor woman. So I'm looking forward to having Carol bring her into the limelight for a little while. Thanks for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. We hope you've enjoyed listening. If you have, perhaps you'd like to give us a review or a like. And by all means, subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss the next one. Thanks for listening.